Hey, what's up YouTube? Today we are going to go over server actions and how you can implement them inside of your Next.js 13 or 14 project. But before we do that, if you can hit that like button and also subscribe for more content just like this, that'd be greatly appreciated. But other than that, let's jump right into it. So as you can see on my screen, I have the Next.js docs open inside of the server actions section. If you want, you can pause the video and read through the docs. Other than that, let's talk about what server actions are and why you should use them. So server actions actually integrate React actions for a built-in solution for server mutations. And server mutations allow you to update your database either by creating new documents, deleting documents, updating them, or reading them. And you could do this all within the same component. So if we scroll over to the next page, this is how server actions work. So instead of manually creating API endpoints like you did in the past, instead, you just define a synchronous server function directly inside of your component. This will make all of your code in one area, making it more organized and clean. And then server actions can also be defined in server components, or they can be called from the client component. So now let's jump into the code and see how all this works. So what we have here is we have the code on the left and the development server on the right. And on the left, let's go over the code. So what we are using is Next.js 14, and this is a server component, and that is by default. And we are using Prism as the ORM and MongoDB as the database. If you want to learn about these two specific subjects, I do have videos on this on my YouTube channel, so go check those out. But this is a server action video, so let's just talk about server actions and things related. So what I'm doing is I'm calling the database and storing all of the expenses inside of the expenses variable on line 7. And then we are just mapping through all the expenses and listing the name and the amount, as you can see here in our development server. So this, like I said, is a server component. So the next step I want to do is I want to mutate the data. I want to add more expenses to this expense tracker. And the way to do that is pretty much back in the day is you would call an API route from your backend, and then your backend will request the data from the database and then push it back to the client page. But now with server actions, you could do it all in one place. But before we get into server actions, let's go over the old way of calling and mutating data like we did with client components. So first off, right above the UL, we are going to have a form. And inside this form, we're going to have an input, 2 inputs, and then a button, just like this. And what you'll do in the past is you would put on the form an on submit, and you'll call function, whatever you want to name it, add expense. And then we will create the function above the return as an asynchronous function. And then we're going to get an error thrown at us saying we can't use this event handler because this isn't a client component. So what you have to do in the past, even if you use Next.js, is you have to mark this whole page as a use client. And the directive will be at the top right here. So it'll look just like this. And like I said, this is the old way of doing it. And now, after you do that, you will just await. You'll wait, and then you'll do a fetch request to your backend API endpoint, whatever it is. And then you'll do like a post request and then passing all the data and stringifying it through, just like this. And then you also set up a backend API folder inside of this specific path right here, and then you'll call the database. So there's a lot of steps to this, and server actions make this a lot simpler. So we're going to remove this for now, remove the use client directive, and we are going to remove the on submit. So that is the old way of doing it. Now server actions allow us to do everything inside the server component and mutate the data inside of this specific file. So instead of on submit, we're going to have action, and then this action is going to call the add expense function like this. So now we got to create the add expense function. And what we're going to do is we're going to mark this as a use server inside of this code block. Just like that. And then instead of taking in the event, action by default allows us to take in the form data on forms. So it's going to be form data, and the type is going to be form data if you're using TypeScript, just like that. So now we have no errors. We refresh the page. Everything looks good. Now we could do our server mutation right inside of this code. But first we need to get the values. And what I'm going to do is I am just going to change up these inputs and labels inside my form to match what I have on this right here. So let me just copy this over real quick. Control C. So what I did is I pretty much have an input with a type of text. I have a name attribute, a placeholder, a class name, and required for 2 different inputs, as you can see here. And the way you get the values from these inputs is by storing them in a variable. So we could call this expense name, and then we're using the formData.get method, and we just put the name, whatever we have here, there. So now we're storing in this variable, and let's do it for the other input as well, which is expense amount. So now we have the 2 values inside of these variables. Now let's do the server mutation inside of the server action. So what we could do here is we could just say const expense equals await. And this is how you create a new document inside of MongoDB using Prism. And it'll be name and amount. And now we're getting TypeScript errors because name says it could be null. So we're going to say this is as string, and this one, it says it could be null, and this is a type number. So we're just going to put the number like this, and then put everything in parentheses. And now all of our type errors should be gone. And this allows us to do a server mutation on the actual component itself. And this whole file is a server component. So let's test this out to make sure everything's working. So I'm going to make this bigger. I'm going to inspect the page, and we're going to go to the network tab. We're going to try to add an expense here. So we're going to say we went to Chipotle, and it cost us $10, and we're going to click add expense. And now we're going to look over here at the network tab, and we get a 200 request status code of 200. It's a post request, and it is making a call to this endpoint right here. Even though we didn't create the endpoint, we're using a server action. So it looks like everything worked, but the only thing is the form has not reset, and then also the UI hasn't actually updated. So let's refresh the page, and now you can see Chipotle $10 is here. So there's a few problems when we run into this. One is the form needs to revalidate. So let's go over that. So let's minimize this again. And let's actually revalidate all of the data. And the reason why that this Chipotle $10 didn't actually get updated when I submitted it is because Next.js caches all of the requests. So on line 7 right here, this request is just going to keep fetching the same request unless you revalidate the data. So to do that, you have to import the revalidate at the top, revalidate path at the top of your component. So it's going to look like this, and that's from next/cache. And we can do this inside of the add expense function. So we're just going to revalidate the path of whatever the path name is, which in my case is the expense tracker, as you can see here in the URL. So now let's try this again. Let's save the code. And this should allow us to update the UI when we actually submit whatever the expense is. So let's say we went to the bar and we spent $25. We click add expense. And as you can see, it automatically updates the unordered list with a new listed item right here, because we are revalidating all of the request inside of this component. So that is how you use server actions inside of server components. But like I said, we run into a few problems. The form isn't resetting, so let's fix that. To make the user experience a lot better, we must be able to reset the form, and the only way to do that is using client-side interactivity. So as you can see, after you submit the bar $25, it still stays there. This should be reset. So the way we are going to fix this is we have to actually make some changes to our code and refactor the code so we can actually implement server actions and use client-side code. So if we go back to the docs, and we're going to make this a little bigger, As you can see, the server action section with client components, you can create your server action in a separate file with the use server directive at the top of the file. Then you import the server action into your client component. So that's what we're going to do now. So as you can see in the example, we are going to create an actions folder, even though they don't, and then an actions file inside of that. And then you must mark the use server directive at the top. And then you could define your server action here. And then you could import it into a client component, as you can see here. So this is a client component, and we are importing the server action into here, and then you could still use it inside of the form in a client component. So that is what we're going to do. There's a quick example, but let's go over that real quick. So let's make this half and half. Go back to our development server. And like I said, we need to refactor some of our code. So I'm going to make this bigger too. And what we're going to do is we're going to move the form into its own component. So to do that, inside of the components folder, we're going to create a form.tsx. We'll do RAFCE, which is the ES7 snippet. We can remove the import from React at the top. We're going to go back. We're going to cut the form, and then we're going to paste it inside of the return. And then what we're going to do here, let's make sure we import the button, which is in the components folder. And then we can remove the add expense inside of the action. So like the example showed is we must define the action inside its own file, and then we could import it here at the top and then push it inside of this action to actually use the server action. So what we could do here is we could create an anonymous function. So we're going to have an async, and it's going to be form data. It'll be an arrow function with some code block. And then we are going to await the function name we're going to call. So we have to create a function inside the server action file called add expense. And then we're passing in the form data there. So let's do this. And what we're doing here is we are refactoring the code. And let's also mark the form as a use client, so we could actually reset the form because it does use client-side interactivity. And then let's go back to our page, and where we remove the form, let's import the form from this new component, just like this. So there we go, just like that. So now let's create a new folder called actions. And inside the actions, let's create a new file, and you can name the same thing. I'm just going to call this form action.ts, just like that. And inside the form action.ts, let's mark the top as a use server. And this is where the server action and all the logic is going to be done. And this is for client-side interactivity using server actions. So let's import Prism client from @Prism client. And let's make sure we get the revalidate path so it could update the UI. And that's from next/cache. And then let's make sure we initialize Prism client, just like this, new Prism client. Let's create the function export const add expense. This is going to be an async function. Let's close the code block, and this is going to take in the form data, right? And the type is form data. Let's make this a capital 2. Just like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab the values the same way we did with the server, which is going to be expense name. And this is going to be formdata.get, the expense name. And then we're going to have the expense amount, which looks exactly the same as we did earlier. And what we're going to do here is then we're going to mutate the data, right? Because this is where our server action is. So we're going to say const expense equals, and then we're going to create it right here. And this is going to be expenses like this. Mark this one as a string, and then this one as a number, because we need to make sure the types are right, because this is TypeScript. And the last step we're going to do here is we're going to revalidate the path. And this path we are going to revalidate is going to be still the expense tracker. Perfect. So that is how your server action looks, and this must be created in a use server component. But we want to import it inside of this client component, so we can still do that. So we're going to say import add expense like that from actions / form action, which we just created, and then it's going to be right here. So let's just make sure this is working before we keep going. Let me make sure these pages are side by side. Let's refresh. And as you can see, nothing changed. Let's add another expense. Let's say we got a tent from Walmart for 20 bucks, add expense, and tent for 20 bucks still pops up. So everything works still the same. We just refactored the code into different components to make this work. But like you said, the form is still not pretty much resetting, which is a bad user experience. So to reset the form, we have to go to the client component, right? Which is this form right here. So let me remove this and that, and then right below the add expense, we are going to have a different import, and we are going to import useRef. This is going to allow us to manipulate the form to reset it without re-rendering the page. So we're going to take the ref.current and then a question mark dot, and then we're just going to use the reset prop function just like that. And then what we need to do here is we're getting an error because it can't find the name. So we're going to say ref equals ref like that. And then I have to initialize it as well, which I totally forgot. So we're going to say const ref equals useRef, and it'll be an HTML form element, and we're going to have the initial value as null, and then we're going to have ref equals ref, and then ref.current.reset. So this allows us to reset the form, and it had to be a client component. That's the only way we could use this React hook. So let's try something else. Let's try dinner. Dinner $50. We click add expense. The form resets and it adds the expense down here. Perfect. So everything is working. The reset form is working, and the server action is still working as well without making calls to the API endpoint. Now, the next thing I want to do to make this even better is when you click add expense, I want to have a loading state. So it should say like loading when it's loading. And then when the expense gets added, the loading will go away, the form will reset, and then the add expense button will be back to normal. Adding a loading loader inside of this application is very simple. And if you actually go through the docs of Next.js, it tells you exactly what to use. I mean, there's multiple ways you could do it. You could probably use useState, but there is an even better way. So if I make this a full size page, if I scroll down, go to forms and mutations, and then there is a section about displaying loading state right here. And it is recommending that we use the useFormStatus hook to show loading state when a form is submitting on the server. And the useFormStatus hook can only be used as a child of a form element using a server action. And then it gives you an example right here of how you could use it, and then how we can implement it in our code. So let's show half of the screen again. Open up our code, and we are going to go to the button component. So inside of the button component, let's make this bigger. We have just the add expense. So what I want to do here is make sure you have the button as a use client because it is client-side interactivity. And we want to import a hook, which is what they recommended, which is the useFormStatus. And this is from React DOM. And what we're going to do here is inside of the useFormStatus, we can access the pending state. So right here, just like that. So you're going to say const pending equals the useFormStatus. And then what we're going to do here is in the button, we're going to have a dynamic value. So we're going to say if pending is true, we could say adding just like that. And if it's not true, we're going to say add expense. So that is the text of the button depending on the state that we get from the useFormStatus. So this allows us to actually see and use whatever the status is of our server action. So we're going to copy this area disabled and we're going to add it to our button as well. So we're going to disable the button if the status is pending as well. So I'm going to remove this right here. And now let's test our code. So we are going to just move this over, make this bigger. Let's refresh the page and let's add another expense. So this expense could be school supplies. We're going to say $30. And if we click add expense, it says adding and then add expense. And then it adds it right here. Let's do another one. So we could say Xbox, $400. Click it, it says adding, and then it adds the expense. So that is a loading state and makes the user experience a lot better. So those are the main topics I want to go over when it comes to server actions. That is how you can use it on a form and how you should be able to implement it inside of your Next.js 13 or 14 application. If this video has helped you in any way, like I said at the beginning, hit that like button and also subscribe for more content. And if you do have any questions, just leave them down in the comments and hope to see you guys soon.